all, I'd like to extend a big thank you to the three invited speakers who presented already. I think their presentations were hugely insightful and very pertinent to the footfall research as it continues to unfold here in Ireland. So, and I think it's collectively they've really informed a good sense of the issues facing our sector, both in the Irish context and internationally. So I think we're going to keep this session quite discursive and keep some time at the end for questions for our invited speakers, especially Val and Jason, who haven't had any questions from the floor yet. So, I mean, I have a few questions that I might pose as we go along, and I know I'm mindful as well of the three themes that are going to kind of frame this afternoon's session, so I'm going to try and pose questions in relation to those as well. So I guess it might be useful if I introduce myself. I'm Joanne Laws and I'm based in Leitrim. I'm an arts writer. And I was brought on board over the summer to sort of write up the final report really, which hopefully will be available in summary form at least in early 2015. Yeah, and I suppose after I came on board, I quickly realised that there was a distinct lack of existing research on this subject in the Irish context. So as a result, we've already kind of had to look internationally for existing research like the Midwest Project and Common Practice and other examples taking place elsewhere. So, but I guess within the Irish context, one name that kept cropping up in terms of being referred to relevant people was Meg Morley in relation to her artist-led archive, which she established in 2006. So for those of you who haven't had an opportunity to have a look at the archive displayed here today, maybe Meg, if you could maybe give us an insight into why you established the archive, maybe how you went about doing that, and how maybe what you see as the function of it, I suppose, today.
Okay, sorry, is that a bit loud? Well, I suppose 2006 it's quite a while ago now, but I suppose actually came from working in an artist-led initiative at the time called ENZO, and working kind of in a collective in Ireland at that time, there wasn't very much support or understanding of what that meant, and actually I think it was the exposure to the international artist-led scene that happened when I attended the International Artist Study Day that Jason coordinated, that really kind of exposed me to, well actually there is global context for this activity. There's an historical one, there's and a live one right now, and it kind of led me sort of to question, well, what is the Irish context for this activity? And I started to research that, and I found very little. So that's where the kind of idea of, well, actually you need to kind of really need some documentation on this. And it wasn't so much that I was going to author that history, it was about collecting the information so that there could be multiple authors of multiple histories. So that was the idea of the format of the archive as being this kind of original form of commons in a way, that that documentation could offer multiple meanings and multiple narratives that may in fact sometimes be in conflict with each other. So that was kind of the impetus behind it, and the process was slow. It was much bigger and more laborious than I kind of previously imagined. It involved focus groups all over the country, sort of generating memories around that kind of activity. And some cases, very little documentation exists of the activities, and it does exist in memory and narrative and kind of testimony, with some very, very small pieces of actual documentation. But over the course of 2 years, 85 different kinds of artist-led initiatives were, had surfaced from kind of the late 60s up to the present. and that was kind of toured as a national exhibition programme, and also a discursive platform for talk, trying to generate discussion around this area. So that was the sort of project, and then it moved into, it's now homed in the National Visual Arts Library as part of their special collections. It's accessible there all the time. So I suppose, just speaking to 126, that was one of the things that they kind of felt would be nice to sort of bring some visibility to here, and they made a selection of 9 boxes out of the 85 to bring down.
And in terms of the accounts that possibly only exist in people's memories, did you go about conducting, primary data? Like, did you record those?
I did. I did
accounts?
I did quite a few actually interviews. Some people just wrote like testimonies, and some people kind of documented their diaries as well as documents of the activities of the organisation.
Yeah, they're nice kind of artefacts.
There was no sort of parameter on what kind of materials could enter the art. Could be quite open, and it was also open to myth making and sort of like intervention as well, and playing with that. So, there are some examples of that kind of response as well from artists.
And I guess in terms of the footfall research, the fact that there is such a limited scope of existing research in the Irish context makes
Use your mic, Joanne.
Oh.
It's on.
Hello? Yeah. It makes it kind of daunting, I suppose, but also kind of exciting as well. There isn't a huge amount of existing research in the Irish context. So just in terms of the footfall, if we could maybe move on to Shelley. And Shelley has worked really tirelessly on the research so far, in questionnaire design, collating data and analysis, and liaising as well with all the organisations that are so well represented here today. So I just have a very quick question for Shelley, and relates to the terminology of the research, the parameters, and how terms are being, terms like artist-led organisations, how are you defining that for the purposes of the research?
Yeah, I suppose for Footfall we said, as I said in the book, we wanted to set the parameters, just looking at organisations that are currently running or closed in the last 5 years, run by professional artists, and deliver an annual programme of contemporary visual art exhibitions or projects in Ireland or Northern Ireland. And the reason I suppose we limited it to that is because we're not academics at 126. We're not researchers that would be able, or qualified, I suppose, to analyse all forms of artist-led, or because there's many, of course, with like festivals or collectives or art studio spaces even, So we wanted, but we are, I suppose, we do understand how to develop an exhibition programme, and we understand what's involved in running it, and we understand the relationships that are made between artists who are working there and artists who exhibit there, the work that happens, and the audience, the relationship with the audiences. So that's why I suppose we wanted to start there. Hopefully, as Footfall goes on, or the research kind of continues on, there might be ways of bringing in other types of artist-led work. But I suppose for now we just kind of wanted to start there. And
that sounds brilliant. And I think it might be a good time to bring Val in as well, in relation to your capacity as chair of the national campaign. And we've seen a kind of shift over the last few years away from the economic argument for culture towards more of an emphasis on a need for research, and highlighting the importance of robust primary research on the arts in Ireland. I guess in terms of Footfall, it would be really useful to know, maybe this is a kind of, I can't work out if this is a really simplistic question or if it's a really complex one, but in terms of informing, well, there's a question. But in terms of informing future policy, how would, research such as Footfall, how would that process come about?
Well, I guess it's an ambition with the National Campaign for the Arts, attention to the issue of research. The campaign isn't in a position, nor will it ever be, and I probably shouldn't aspire to be, the organisation that carries out that research. but it does act as a kind of amplifier of the need for that research. I think potted history, you know, was the NCFA was born in the flames of 2007 or 2009, excuse me, and in the heat of this thing, the McCarthy report, which was a recommendation that Arts Council goes, a separate, you know, minister and Department for Arts goes, etc. Film board money go, everything goes. So in that, the shock of that is the response, the immediate response, and quite a big network was developed with coordinators attached to different constituencies. It was quite a politically orientated sort of structure. And then, of course, it's how to survive, or what happens, you know, after that heat. So the last couple of years has been the time where there has been this attention then given to advocating for not just more research, but a different kind of research. And in terms of the role of the likes of 126, there's this word stakeholder. If you look at the stakeholder lists attached, research does get commissioned, just not an awful lot of it. It's not totally not happening. It's been happening, but patchy, erratic, you know, just not very well. There's no overview. There's nobody or if there is, it's not getting to the policy makers. It's happening somewhere else. So I think initiatives like 126 is about. I know this is kind of the most thrilling kind of language, maybe, or it's, you know, it's a controversial enough term to talk about stakeholders, but I think there's scope to redefine that, to sort of take that term and claim it. For example, if you do look at stakeholder lists attached to research in the arts, just look who's not there. It's as simple as that. And to bear that in mind in the kind of currency, there's a lot of kind of political capital has been carved out of the use of consultation, you know, at present again, in terms of whether it's the Department of Arts or, you know, Arts Council has just gone through a kind of consultation process. So it is about coming forward. If you're not being consulted, it's about coming forward and saying, hey, you forgot about me, I am one of those stakeholders. And also the kind of knowledge that I have may not be something within your definitions right now, but it's not my problem. You've got to go and review your kind of definitions. So you've got to think about the quality of your research proposal, if you like. Mm-hmm. And then the next thing you need to do is talk to me about it and talk about designing that. So it's a long-term process. So I hope that's an answer to the question, well, where the initiatives like 126. So I think that the issue of, you know, this isn't it's not research coming through a commercial or professional, you know, kind of sector researchers or academic researchers. But the argument to be made for the value of the knowledge that you're bringing into that research is what I think that is happening here today. And it's taking on your own authority and understanding within your own capacity what the scope of your knowledge is and coming forward and making that contribution. So from the NCFA's point of view, this is a concrete example that when it comes to a discussion that briefly I might just mention that Kerry McCall, who's involved in our steering group and heads up this sort of research working group for the NCFA, is leading on a bid for some funding for next year's EU research funding. And the NCFA is one of the kind of signed bid stakeholders on that. But if that comes through, that will be where we can start to actually test this kind of review of who do we go out and talk to, and an expedient response from the likes of the Arts Council or whoever it is saying, well, we haven't the capacity or the money or whatever to go and talk to all these, so we'll do it okay, you know, but we won't talk to everybody. That just can't be. There's no point in doing that again. There has to be a transformation in terms of a kind of respect and an esteem given to the kind of knowledge that comes from the likes of artist-led organisations. So I suppose it's saying that and saying that directly. The last thing I should say about the NCFA is there's no prohibition on what the NCFA can say to the Department of Arts or the Arts Council, whatever. You know, pretty good relations with the Arts Council. There's certainly no hostility there, but there's a respectful exchange of demands or desires or ideas about what the right way to go about things are, because the NCFA receives no funding. There is no conflict whereby, and I'd have to say other sectors, you know, like the charity sector, or have no, they just ignore this kind of direction from their parent funding department to not speak against their policy. They constantly speak against their policy. But I think that there's a misjudged adherence to that prohibition in the kind of arts cultural scene. Is that you're kind of breaking some kind of you kind of are breaking the law, but you know it happens elsewhere. But listen, that's something for other people to consider. But for the NCFA, because there is no conflict there's no funding coming from the Department of Arts or for the Arts Council. And I guess what you can hear there is that it's making the political argument. Is what the NCFA has been doing for the last few years about the value of research.
Can we have a question? Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you to the organizers first to give us a voice in this symposium. And Valerie, I'm just wondering, you know, as you know, as you just said, funding for the visual arts and artist-led organization is disappearing rapidly. And I'm just wondering, beside networking, symposium, engaging, participating, what can we do about it in the context of the National Campaign for the Art? Is there an angle you could have to try to have more visibility and encourage the government to review their policies about the visual arts?
Specifically the visual arts, but the NCFA looks across all the arts. You know, it doesn't make, there are representative organisations for theatre and visual arts and so on. So that has to be something that we're really clear. It's not even so much as not wanting to duplicate. It's just been thinking about what's feasible, you know, what the priorities are. So it's right across the arts. So I guess the NCFA makes the case more generally, if you like. But in a very, it's really simple, but again, it really, I think the simplicity perhaps masks the importance of responding, say, coming up to an election time or budget times. The NCFA will release a kind of template letter, or, you know, get in touch with your local, people who are running for your local council, or running for government, or running for MEPs. It might seem like a really, again, you're not on the barricades, but actually it really matters, and there's an obligation on public representatives to write back to you. So again, it's in terms of making a presence felt. That's a real action, okay? It's not just an administrative procedure or a kind of a masked action. And then in terms of, and it's getting onto your SPCs, it's your social policy committees, which is a really horrible, tough job. People who are involved in it, that's common experience. So it's kind of, it's the long push, Catherine, it's the long haul. And I think that's the hardest thing about it, you know, is to continue. It's to go out once. It's an issue that arises around the marches that are happening around water, or the anti-war marches. 100,000 people go out once. Government says, okay, they won't be back. And when they're not back, then it becomes a problem. But I think it's persistence, because you're dealing with the permanent government. You know, there's the politicians who come and go, but you've also got the civil service who will run any long-term research and so on. So it's getting traction with those people. It just takes, it's persistence. So that's kind of an answer to, well, how do we do it? You keep on going back and going back. The toll that takes, you're the very person to talk about how difficult sometimes it is to sustain that over, I know it's like a lifetime of a kind of an active pushing, you know, for change around policy. But it's also about not an individual, it's about everybody doing it every single time. It's about going and meeting your councillor, it's about going and meeting people who are running for election. In terms of the NCFA, it's been about going and meeting the minister, and when you're not met, that's a problem as well. You know, there is an obligation to meet. So when that's not happening, you've got to ask, well, why is that the case? It's not just happening to the NCFA, it's happening to many, many people, and you're hearing it on the news, is that there's a lack of communication now starting to happen. There's a no response starting to occur. But that said, the NCFA has had a very good record of getting access, particularly around coming up to general election, presidential election, things like that, getting access to the art spokespeople and to interested parties from the political parties. So I suppose that's what we're doing. I don't know if that's.
Sorry, just before you leave that point, Val, just in terms of what each individual can do to support national campaign, just describe that simple little exercise you did with the political letters to your local representatives, where everybody can just go on the NCFA website, select your local political, and click the button, and bang, emails go out to all of your local political representatives. That actually impacts ever so slightly, but just in that business of those political representatives recognise you are a voter.
Well, that's the key thing. You're a voter. It's more than ever so slightly. You're not an artist anymore. And, it's the politician who comes to your door and says, "Oh, I don't have time for that." That's what I get told. I don't have time for that. And you go, "No, I am a voter. You're speaking to me now. I'm a constituent in your." But it is about initiatives. It is about other people taking initiatives. The NCFA is completely voluntary, totally and completely voluntary. So we give, I suppose, or make that time, put that time to the work that we do. But again, I don't even know if it's desirable that the NCFA would become, a very big organisation that's very, very centralised. I think it would be kind of counter how actually things work towards change now. I think that it's really working as an amplification to actions that other people take is the key to success there. And it does have access, and it does have an ear.
That's a simple action every one of us can take, is go onto the website, hit that submit button, select your local reps, and those letters go out. And if there's a really big, simple participation in that action, then all this slowly amplifies in the long haul. Simple action.
Would it be worth hearing from our international contributors on this as well, about potential organisational forms for the artist-led sector in the Irish context? I mean, Jason, just in relation to your past experience with Midwest and your upcoming research, unions, coalitions, advocacy groups, networks, in your experience, what types of formats work, and do you have any suggestions about what might work here?
It's a tricky one to answer in the sense that it uses sort of Irish cultural policy isn't sort of my specialist sort of area, and I'm not exactly sure how it all entirely sort of operates or connects or disconnects as a kind of sort of structure. But I suppose there are some basic things that I think are always kind of worth asking, which might piss people off, but sort of what is the value of the temporal sort of labour, the commitment against the amount of finance you can actually genuinely raise. So I think that always needs to be thought about. I mean, basically, how much are you killing yourself to get €2,000 out of somebody, and is there another way, either through sort of public sort of sector or sort of other modes of beneficiaries that allow you to basically escape having to do that?
Free up some time.
Yeah, well, free up some sort of energy or entrapment. I think it's very easy at points to discuss that we are trapped in by capital and not trapped in by sort of public sector policy. And, so when I'm not always convinced that we are also trapped by public sector policy, particularly because I think we also have to recognise, and I think you identified this in your sort of answer to it as well, Val, is that in sort of local sort of cultural policy, the policy changes very regularly depending on who's elected. So you can spend so much energy reiterating back a cultural policy framework that basically 1 year later no longer exists because the political party's moved into a different sort of arena of power around it, or it's sort of changed. And so I think that lots of organisations that desire sustainability have become very sophisticated in their way around that, and it is the long haul. So I suppose that's one sort of set of things, like basically like, okay, how much am I going to kill myself to raise sort of 2,000, 3,000 euro within a sort of thing. What is the nature? I mean, you mentioned this as well about what really is the nature of sacrifice here, and what sacrifices are worth making, which are not. Because any sort of form of investment in sort of public value actually is quite often determined by sacrifice, whether the sacrifice is temporal, financial, sort of a belief, disbelief, etc. So that's always what people just quantifying on the limited sort of resources. And we're ostensibly talking, as well, I mentioned about voluntary labour, and we have to think about actually what does that mean in these situations. I think another sort of mechanism in terms of sort of policy intervention is the kind of question of probity. So people who make policy never want to hear individuals, sort of because then they're seen to be responding to individual. So neat and politically, that's quite sort of dangerous. So basically, I think critical mass and coalition basically gets things done that individuals on one hand can't be seen to be doing or seen to be supporting. So I think coalition work is really, really important. So I suppose those are two things. One, actually quantify sort of the need, other ways of doing it, and not necessarily suggesting commercial sort of mechanisms of doing it. But I mean, I personally fund a whole series of small sort of things with small amounts of money at various kind of times myself, because I think it is something I should do. I'm very fortunate. I'm in a luxurious position. I have an academic post. I'm not paid shit for the work that I do, etc. And I feel that I have a social responsibility to a sort of field to fund other things in order to prevent people from being in those types of situations, actually. And I think that I'm not the only person like that. There are numerous people like that, and there are numerous people who actually probably also want to support very grassroots-based activity, but identifying where that activity truly sits is complicated, actually, because there are powers of visibility around it, and I think that by producing visibility through critical mass, there may be other mechanisms of support outside of public policy. Having said that, I also understand that you have to ostensibly make the public purse pay for the boss. That has to happen too, so this is a discursive thing.
Yeah, I really like the idea of a coalition and this kind of critical mass, and I was wondering if we could hear from any of the organisations that may have thoughts on this. I know there probably is the fear that in contributing to some sort of platform or format, it's just going to be more time, more energy, more unpaid labour. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Can I just point out that we don't actually have a national cultural policy at the moment, and that the outgoing Minister for the Arts had made an announcement that one would be launched in 2020. So now is the time to start lobbying towards what that policy might contain and what it means for the future of culture in this country.
It's now 2025. Is that gone off?
I can
So it's now 2025, but it has been formed now, and Heather Humphreys has reconfirmed her commitment to do that, but without a time frame at present. So that's the button, that's what you push. It's like when, who's funding it, who's doing it. You've made the promise, but bear in mind 2016 is a general election. So we're back to the...
Yeah, I mean, I think there's other sort of things that are worth kind of figuring through. So I don't know how many people are aware of the EICP, the European Institute for Progressive Cultural Policy, sort of work that was undertaken sort of online by a period of time, by people like Simon Schack, sort of etc. But they put out a small publication called European Cultural Policy in 2015. Do you remember this? It's Maria Linda sort of edited, so with Abaki, the design agency, and a series of kind of factors. And that publication was made in 2005. And actually 2015 is the predictive point for that publication, examining what they predicted European cultural policy would actually look like in 2015. And obviously, a lot of people who contributed to that report in 2005 are now in quite significant positions of power. Sort of Maria sustained a position of power herself. But people like Simon Schack he's now the head of curating curatorial research at Goldsmiths. There's a whole set of people, the Eastern European people who contributed to that sort of publication are in other kind of positions now. And I think there are things to do, like reconvene those people, get them to reconsider the nature of that kind of cultural policy. So a document that they were predicting in place. And I think though you can't wait till 2025, you have to basically do another set of things at the same time. And I think there are examples of many kinds of sort of routes that can be harnessed in those intermediate sort of moments.
How are we for time with this session?
We're a little bit over. I mean, is there anything else you want to cover before we finish up for lunch?
Yeah.
Yeah, there is some
I
time.
was going to ask a question, and I'd ask people not to shoot me afterwards when I ask it, because I've heard so far the theme of FOOTFALL is articulating the values of arts-led organisations. And there's two answers that come to the floor. And the first one is a critical perspective, is that as an artist-led organisation, we have a critical voice, and critical voice is needed for a healthy functioning society. Then the second answer is the democratic argument, is that in fostering this dialogue, that this is the well-being of society is at the heart of it. The third one I'm going to throw onto the agenda is, again, just being polemical here. The third one is about pleasure and regeneration. And I don't know if I'm watching too many BBC 4 documentaries at the minute, but I think of factory records, I think of creation records, I think of rough trade as organisations with a sense of fun, a sense of let's go out and do it, let's try and create a culture on our own terms that we can live by, and of course they've all crashed and burned wonderfully. And it seems as if all the debate at this point has been about challenging government for a source of funding to try and keep us alive, to try and keep things going forward. And I was thinking, well, if I go back to, I think of Belfast and I think of Capitalist Arts, and one thing I recognise that not only did they occasionally show some good art, they could throw a hell of a party. And there seems to be, and this is where it gets kind of quite contentious, as it were, it seems to be at the heart of artist-led organisations is the idea that it's a good way to live and you can have good fun. Can you foster that without any reliance on state funding, government funding? Can you embrace, let's call it the neoliberal economy, give them to a certain degree what they want, the idea of regeneration, but actually ourselves have a good time and not spend our lives chasing policy makers? Very interested to get some feedback.
I fundamentally, I fundamentally think that that is possible. But I think what it also takes is a certain sort of brain space to basically alleviate yourself of certain types of pressure or certain sort of modes of reinventing the wheel. Because I mean, this conversation is a conversation that's continued ad infinitum for a long period of time. Is sort of do we have to should artist-led preserve some notion of political autonomy and still receive state subsidy to be so? I mean, it's kind of fundamental to this debate. There doesn't seem to be any kind of clear, conclusive sort of aspects to it. I mean, one of the things that I did when I lived in the Netherlands in the late 90s was, I think I conducted 146 sort of case studies of organisations that basically saw themselves to be for the public good, but basically were conducting particular ways of sort of doing it, such as, for example, an organisation called FOOTFALL, which was a bike courier company that was entirely sort of staffed in terms of couriers with people with mental health problems or issues or even sort of mental health. And through basic physical exercise and endorphin level, these people were kind of sort of becoming supposedly healthier, very small modes of social sort of interaction, but it was funding a whole set of other less sexy projects. So they basically had one sort of project that they were able to sort of basically articulate very clearly that was generating income and going into their less articulatable sort of projects. So when I think, so it's a capital mode in a sense. But I think there are many other ways of generating projects actually that don't require you to be constantly doing that. But it's a particular ideological position to take, inevitably too. Sort of I think it is important that life equals fun actually at the same time. So I think there are many ways to do these things. I mean the situation in Southeast Asia, sort of in sort of Singapore, sort of Hong Kong, places where sort of public discourse is very limited and controlled, are exercising whole other mechanisms by which to sustain artist-led sort of cultures.
Brilliant. I actually still have a couple of questions, but I think I might save them because I'm kind of hungry as well. So,
can I just say something about the pleasure thing?
Yeah.
Just to finish off.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I missed the earlier comments, but I think the problem with thinking about pleasure is that in a Foucauldian sense, how do you conceptualize or frame the concept of pleasure and how one experiences it and perceives it? Obviously, it's not a neutral thing. So in terms of, say, how pleasure has been set up as an oppositional thing in relation to resistance or political activity of a certain kind, so that resistance might be seen as curmudgeonly, po-faced against pleasure. All of those conceptualizations are at play, even if we think about how we might have pleasure as a source of release from the horrors of resistance, of political activity, of functioning within a very difficult and problematic artistic sphere. So in that sense, the idea of release from something is very problematic as well, because of course, you have to fight for pleasure as much as you have to fight for everything else. So pleasure is not an innocent or neutral concept at all, and actually the best pleasures are well fought for. And so I don't think you can separate them in that sense and sort of seek a simple release from pleasure. But I don't think that Gavin meant that. I mean, I think that you included that in your question, really, this idea of how can it be factored in, how can we rethink pleasure as a constitutive force in resistance, maybe, is something that we should think about.
I was just thinking of dancing.
On that note, I think we'll have lunch and convene back in an hour.